today is some stitching, obviously. I'm going to keep it quite simple today. We had our crosses last week, so our kisses that we did last week. Loving all the ones that I'm seeing. And I thought we'd go into two of my favourite stitches. So French knot with two variations on the French knot, and also a bullion stitch. So we're going to keep our background quite simple. I've just got some gorgeous fabrics from Ticking Stripes off Instagram, and Wendy sells her work on there. Well, sells loads of things on there. It's very dangerous to go and have a look, but I would recommend having a look. So she'd put some packs of some beautiful fabrics together. So I've got a piece of the stripy fabric, Ticking Stripes, quite apt really, that I'm going to use on my piece. And then I have a little bit of a backing fabric on there. I was just going to use one piece, but then I decided just to use two, but choose a colour. So I've just gone with cream and blue for my background. So I've cut a piece that's just slightly smaller than my tag. People have asked how big my tags are. They're 4 inch by 2, but my stitching space is about 3 inch by 2. I've put my other piece on, so I've got a bit of a contrast with a pattern and a stripe. I've done it so it's a little bit longer because I'm going to wrap that one around the bottom, because I quite like them when you actually extend it beyond your tag. And then you're going to choose a coloured thread that you wouldn't normally work in. So obviously for me it's pink, even though I do work in quite a bit of pink, but I would choose something that's going to contrast from your background. So we're going to look at 2 stitches. So I've just pinned my piece of fabric in place, and I'm going to take inspiration, just move a few bits that way. I'm going to take inspiration from my fabric. So I'm going to start off with some French knots going up the middle to make my life a little bit easier, so that I don't have to do it with pins. I am just going to run a running stitch. So I've just got a pale pink. I am just going to run a very quick running stitch just up the middle, because when you're trying to do French knots and you've got pins in, it doesn't make your life very, very easy. You could obviously stitch this in a matching thread, but this pale pink, you actually can't really see it. There was a noise then, it sounded like I'd got a cat in the room, but I know I haven't got a cat in the room because the door's shut. But it doesn't surprise me sometimes, actually. I think our cats can just get in anywhere. Right, take that pin out. Pins are great, but they can be a bit of a pain. So just doing a little tacking stitch. It'll just hold things in place. Okay. So the 2 knots that I'm going to do, they're 2 of my favourite ones. So we're going to look at a French knot. And a little bit like when we did the fly stitch, I'm going to ask you to have a bit of a play. It's brilliant to do the stitches as they are and get them really, really accurate. And if that's what you want to do, fab. I like to play with the stitches because I really like to use stitch as a texture, building up textures. So spreading them out, overlapping them. If you've done some of the challenges before, we have done a French knot one. We did it in the tiny book. And I think I did French knots. And I know I did a bullion stitch in the big one as well. So they are stitches that we have done before. But I just absolutely love them. And it's going to be up to you as to how many you do on your tag and how you want to present them. So I'm going to take inspiration to start off with from my piece of fabric. So for the start of my French knots and my bullion knots, I'm going to take inspiration. So okay, just tap that down. So knot in the back. Okay, there we go. Right, so threads that I'm using, I've got 2 perlé threads. I've got an 8 and a 12, and then I've got a Danish cotton thread. These come as single threads, really, really nice to stitch with, but use DMCs, any type of embroidery thread that you've got is perfectly fine. Size of needle, I just tend to look for ones that my thread will go through as a starting point, but try to get them without too big an eye, because we're doing knots. If you've got a really big eye on your needle, it's a bit extreme this one, but it goes a lot wider where the eye is, and it just makes it a little bit harder to get the thread off. Okay, so we'll start with our French knots. So my intention to start off with is a line of French knots. So we'll start here at the bottom. I'm left-handed. Sorry if you're right-handed, but it's the same principle, you just do it the other way. So what you need to do is bring your thread up through the fabric. You point your needle away from the hole with the thread running parallel, and then wrap your thread round 5 or 6 times. And then what you're going to do is go back down practically where you just came up. Just pull that thread a little bit so you can see the knot is then gathering at the bottom of your needle, and then just pull that through nice and slowly. Just make sure you don't get any knots actually in your threads as they're going through. There we go. And you end up with a little knot just there at the bottom. Okay, so I'm going to do a line of these going up. Okay, so do it again. Got my thread, I've come up, pointing my needle away from the hole, wrap it round 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times. It could be 3 times, depending on how many times, depends on how big the knot ends up being. I'm going back down where I came up. I've just pulled that thread at the bottom, and then just pull your thread through nice and slowly and create your knot. So I'm going to go all the way up. Once you get going, point away, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, back down, pull it so the threads are at the bottom. Pull your thread through. You'll notice I'm just catching that with my fingers just so that it pulls that through without them all getting knotted, because sometimes what can happen is because you're stitching, you end up twisting your threads. Because we're doing all this twisting and the knotting, you can end up with it being quite knotty as it comes back through. So again, just pull it down, pull that through, and create a knot. So I'm going to carry on with knots all the way up that line. Okay, and again I'll do some photos and things to show you. So those are the French knots. Okay, just turn that light off just a little bit. There we go. So they're French knots. Do it one more, so I've got 5. I like odd numbers. Actually, it's just made me think then I could mix this up a little bit. As I always say, as hopefully you've cottoned on to, I do make this up as I'm going along, because initially my intention was to go all the way up on the side, but actually I just think it might be quite nice then to swap over to the other side. It's quite nice having stripy fabric, gives you something to work with, but it could be a checkered fabric and you end up putting the French knots in the little squares. Could be a dotty fabric, so the little dotty one there, could be that. So just play around with whatever fabric you've got. I know I'd said not to buy anything, ideally not to buy anything for this project, but with us all being at home and people like Wendy posting things on her Instagram, you just can't resist. Can't resist whatsoever. Okay. So I'm going to carry on and do 5 this side, then I'll probably do 5 there and 5 there. Okay, right. Bullion stitch. Oops. Oh, actually, no, we'll do 6. We'll do the pistil stitch, which I have done before, which really is just a variation on the French knot. And it's just really, really nice, especially if you were doing something. I love doing it because I do quite a bit of work that's sort of inspired by gardens, and they just look like little flowers on the end of a stitch. I think it's one of those stitches as well that once you learn about them, you become a little bit obsessed with them. Well, I do anyway. I think as well, even though I'm using a pink, I think what I might do is use the pinks for the French knots and the pistil stitch, and then I might use a blue. Got a dark blue somewhere. Yeah, a bit of a contrast. I think I might have a bit of a dark blue on there as well. So I'm going to do my knots all the way up, and then I'm going to play around with the bullion knots next. There's two different ways again that I'm going to show you how to do the bullion knot, and then it's just all about just playing and just having a go. Okay, right, because I'm going to do the bullion one, I need a different coloured thread and a needle. Go with that one. Normally I like to have all these threaded up beforehand because it's a pain sometimes trying to thread a needle, and I find that, especially like with pearlies and stuff like that, the needle threaders don't always work. There we go, we're through. Okay, a bullion stitch. These end up looking like little caterpillars. They are really, really cute. So I've got some on here. So there we've got the French knots at the bottom. I'll show the pistil stitch in a second, but then we're going to play around with the bullion stitch, which I always think look like little caterpillars. So they can either be quite flat or end up quite loopy on your piece. So because I've got these tracking lines, I think I'm going to do, they're going vertically. I think I'll do some bullions going horizontally. Okay, we'll start here. Right, so what you do for a bullion is you actually bring the needle out at the top of the stitch. So if you want the stitch to come down here, you start at the top. Bring your thread through. Okay, you're going to hold on to that. You then put your needle in at the bottom. So I'm going to go between my French knots there at the bottom, and then bring it back up. Hopefully you can see that. So my thread came out here, which is the top of the stitch. The needle's gone back in at the bottom and then come back out. You need to leave it in the fabric. It's all about wrapping. So what we're going to do now is wrap your thread around the needle, and you want the amount of wrapping to be the same. So that's going to be the distance of my stitch, and then I've done the same amount of wrapping on my needle. Now it's quite fiddly because what you've now got to do is pull your needle and the thread through the wound bit. Okay, so I tend to pinch it with my finger and thumb and just wiggle it through. So you can just use your nail just to pull all those threads off, then slowly pull your thread through. And what happens is as you get to the end, it naturally comes back over the top. So it's coming back over, and then your needle goes back down the bottom. And then you create your bullion stitch. Okay, so I'll do another one. I'll do one here. So I'm going to come out at the top of the stitch, so where I want the top of the stitch to be. Okay, top of the stitch. There's my thread. The needle then, I'm going to go between these two French knots here. The needle's going in at the bottom and then comes back up. There we go, where your threads come out. Okay, wrap it around. So you've got the same amount of thread, so that that bit there is the same amount as the distance from the top and bottom. Just hold it with your thumb and finger. Use your other hand just to pull that needle through slowly. and then as it gets there you come back over, just wiggle those down and then go down. Okay, so you're sort of creating like these little caterpillars. So you've got little dots and little caterpillars. And then you can just start playing around with where they're going to go. So I might do a few that way. So I'm really going to base it up and down this tram line. Okay, right, so just to show you a couple of variations, I'll do it on this one because I'll carry on working on that and then I'll put some photos on. But I'll do a couple more demonstrations just so that you can get your head around what we're doing. Okay. Right, so bullion knot on here. So I come up at the top of the stitch, get my needle, decide how long I want the knot to be, go down and then back up. So I've come back up where the thread came out. Okay, got that, wrap it round. Move my needle just out a little bit. Go. So it could be, it depends on how big you want your bullion stitch to be, but what I've now got is that distance there, I've got the same distance in thread on my needle. Okay, pull your needle through, just use your thumb and finger just to hold that on, so you can just pull your needle through. You might just need to use your nail just to pull those threads off, just tease them off or just give it a bit of a wiggle so that it comes through. So I'm holding those bits there at the bottom, I'm pulling that thread through. Okay, so I pulled it through and then that naturally comes over the top. Keep pulling the thread through until it's nice and tight, and then your needle goes back down up the bottom and you've created your bullion stitch. Now to create a loopy one like this one, all you do is you shorten the distance between the 2 points. So bring your needle up. This time I'm only going to go a small distance away, so in, but still back up where that thread comes out, and this time you're going to put more on your needle than the distance, and this is what creates the loop because you've got more thread than length on your fabric. Okay, so you can see there I've only got a tiny gap, but I've got a lot more thread on my needle. Again, same thing, pull it through nice and slowly, and then you're going to take that needle back down that initial hole, but because you've got more thread, there we go, because you've got more thread on, you create these little sort of caterpillar loops. So they're just quite nice, just a little bit of different way of playing with it. So quick one on the French knot again. So your French knot with this one, you're just going to have lay your thread away from the needle, wrap it round, and then just go back down where you were, and you create your knots. And again, you can play around with these. So if you only go around, say 1, 2, 3 times and go back down, because there's not as much thread on there, you'll create a really tiny dot. Whereas if you go on and wrap it round, I don't know, go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times and go back down, because there's more thread on there, you're going to create a bigger knot. Okay, so you can play around with those. They're quite tight knots, so you can do loopy knots. So when you put it around your needle, 1, 2, oops, oh, come on, 1, 2, 3, 4 times. Don't pull it down at the bottom like I said before. Leave it quite loose on your needle, so then when you pull it through you end up creating little loopy knots, so they're just not as tight. The pistil stitch is just an extension of the French knot. So with this pistil stitch, wrap it round 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and rather than going back down the hole, you just go a little bit further away, and all that you're doing there is just transferring the knot onto the end of a straight stitch. So you get a straight stitch then with a knot on the end. And this is, I just love this as a decorative stitch, especially if you do it in lots and lots of different colours, and vary the size of the knots, even the direction that the stitches go in. It can just end up looking like a little bunch of flowers. So those are the stitches that we're going to be playing around with. I'm going to carry on playing around with my tag, and then I'll put some pictures like normal at the end of the video. So I hope everybody has fun. See you later.